Hi, I'm Mark, this is Mark's Tech Vlogs on YouTube, and today let's talk about Siri. Now, I make it no secret on this channel that I am a big Apple fan. And that means when it comes to my smart home, I do tend to try and pick up devices that are Apple HomeKit compatible or nowadays Matter compatible. If I can't achieve either of those, I do tend to try and find products that I can at least get into my Apple Home app using my Raspberry Pi and Homebridge. And I do tend to prefer Homebridge over the alternatives because it pretty much does exactly what I want, which is just to get stuff into the Apple Home app. But if you've been around on this channel for a while, you'll know that I have previously reviewed Amazon devices that have their voice assistant on. And that's products like the Sonos One and the Echo Show and things like that. And actually, up until around a year ago, I was using Amazon's voice assistant as my main voice assistant around the house to control my smart home. However, a year ago, I replaced all of those devices with HomePod minis. And so a year later, I wanted to ask the question, can Siri run your smart home? And throughout the rest of this video, I'm going to say Apple's voice assistant, so if you've got smart speakers run by Apple, I don't set them off. So when Apple first introduced their voice assistant back in 2010, it wasn't particularly good. For the time, it was quite revolutionary, but it couldn't do half the things it does now. And actually, the pace of other assistants by people like Amazon and Google meant that actually Apple's one fell a little bit behind. However, again, Apple have kind of pushed this in the last few years, especially with the introduction of their HomePods. So given Apple's history of having a voice assistant that hasn't been quite as good as its competitors, why did I decide to make the switch? And for me, there were three reasons. Firstly, I think Apple's voice assistant has pretty much caught up now to the sort of things that I want to do. And with the rumours of Apple introducing a voice assistant device with a screen, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens to it over the next couple of years. Secondly, I'd got to a point where pretty much everything in my smart home is now in my Apple Home app. That means a lot of my automations are set up in the Apple Home app as well, but it also means I can use my watch and my voice assistant to control all those devices. And most of those devices I've got are natively Matter or HomeKit compatible now, with a few that still come in via a Raspberry Pi. I have also got another video coming up pretty soon about my smart home setup, so if you want to see what I've got in my smart home, subscribe below. And then thirdly, what I wanted was a more secure system. And one of Apple's biggest focuses around the last few years has been all around privacy, and I think that's something really important. And Apple claimed that Siri has the strongest privacy out of any voice assistant, and so that was one of the big attractions to it for me. And then of course, as an aside, I already used Apple's voice assistant in a whole variety of places. So I used it with my AirPods and my watch and my phone and in my car. And so actually having one voice assistant for everything rather than jumping between two made a lot of sense. So then before I get into my experience of using Apple's voice assistant all the time over the last year, I should probably talk about how I use voice assistants personally, because everyone uses them differently. So firstly, I use it to control lights and other devices around my house. Siri, turn off office light. Being able to say things like voice assistant, turn on this light, or voice assistant, turn off this light is really useful, especially as I got to a point where a voice assistant is always in range. So if I'm walking to a room, I can ask the light to turn on before I get into that room. And the same goes for triggering scenes. So I've got some scenes set up in Apple's Home that I can ask a voice assistant to trigger. And then thanks to SwitchBot, I also have some Siri shortcuts that trigger some of their infrared remote actions. So I've got some speakers, I can trigger the remote on-off button with my voice. And then secondly, maybe my most used other command is to add things to a shopping list. And this is super helpful if you're cooking and you just need to throw an ingredient on a list. I especially like the latest feature in iOS where it kind of auto-orders them for you in your shopping list into different departments and categories. And I've always used Apple's reminders for that because everyone around the house can contribute to it, and also it's there on every device I've got. And when I was using Amazon voice assistants, I was using Todoist and then a function with IFTTT that said if something's added to that list, add it to my Apple reminders. Now it just natively gets added to my Apple reminders. And then thirdly, I use voice assistants for the everyday stuff we all do. So like setting timers when you're cooking something, or when you want an alarm to wake you up or something like that. And then there's things like playing music. So asking Apple's voice assistant to play whatever I want to listen to on Apple Music is great. And then fourthly, there's the other things that we probably all use voice assistants for. So when you want to quickly divide a tricky number when you're trying to halve a recipe, or when you want to know how many grams is in something, or if you want to know how old a celebrity is. And so that's what I primarily use voice assistants for. So let's talk about my setup with Apple's voice assistant. So of course, firstly, Apple's voice assistant is always with me. It's on my phone, it's on my AirPods, it's on my watch. Of course, it is also on my Mac, but bizarrely, I very rarely use Siri on my Mac. I think I just find my phone or my watch are always easier to reach for to trigger it. And then firstly, as I said at the start of this video, about a year ago I picked up a whole set of HomePod minis to use around my house. If you want to see my review for them, I have got a link below. But essentially they pack a lot of sound quality in and are also really responsive when it comes to a voice assistant. And yes, they are more expensive than things like Echo Dots with a starting point of 99 rather than 25, but you can easily pick them up second hand for about £60. I also personally think the sound quality is better. But essentially the HomePod mini is a great little device to have around your house and packs in enough sound even for listening to music over kind of kitchen fans and things. And I actually find triggering Apple's voice assistant to those devices is more responsive than the Amazon ones were. And of course you can manage those devices in your Apple Home app as well. So that's my setup and what I use voice assistants for, but let's talk about my experience of using Apple's voice assistant over Amazon's for the last year. And after a year I can comfortably say that it works really well for what I want. I find Apple's voice assistant is always capable of doing the basic things like turning on my lights or boosting my heating or things like that. Likewise, opening or closing my blinds or curtains and triggering smart plugs just works well every time. With SwitchBox Hub Mini and Hub 2, being able to hook up infrared commands to Siri as well means that I can trigger things like my speakers or my television with my voice. And that really is where Siri shortcuts is massively powerful. And then of course you can set the scenes from your home app as well. This is great for combining multiple devices at once. I've got one that kind of sets a mood in the living room. And because of the position of the HomePod minis across my house, I find that whichever room I'm in, I can easily trigger one. Slightly bizarrely, if I'm in the kitchen, sometimes the living room one does go off instead. I'm not quite sure how that works. But either way, something responds. And then in addition to that, if you've got a HomeKit compatible video doorbell like the Aqara G4, which I reviewed recently, then all of those HomePod minis can act as a chime. That means you don't need external devices for a chime for when someone rings your door, and it just goes off wherever you are. And of course, you also get those notifications onto your watch and your phone. And then likewise for things like timers and alarms, it just works. Siri, set a timer for 2 minutes.
2 minutes, starting now.
And you can even monitor these if you really want to, going into the HomePod in your Apple Home app. And then for other things, Apple's voice assistant is also super capable of telling you things like the weather. Siri, what's the weather like today?
Looks like it will be partly cloudy today. Daytime temperatures will hover around 16 degrees, with overnight lows around 8.
Or converting measurements, or doing maths, or asking how old Morgan Freeman is. Siri, how old is Morgan Freeman?
Morgan Freeman is 87 years old.
And then you can also use your voice to play music or podcasts. And of course this works best for Apple Music subscribers like myself, because things like Spotify aren't yet supported. It does, however, also work with Deezer and Pandora and a few other services. However, because the HomePod minis are AirPlay speakers, you can AirPlay from the Spotify app to them. You just have to do this manually via your phone. Or start playing on your phone and hold your phone close to the HomePod mini to kind of hand it off. And then things like adding it to shopping lists is really easy because it natively adds it to your Reminders app. And as you'd expect, this is seamless because both are Apple products. And then of course there's some bonus features that actually make using Apple's voice assistant really good around your house. Firstly, Apple's Home Assistant recognises voices, especially when you've got different people with their different Apple IDs attached. Of course, this does assume everyone is using an iPhone, but there are some big advantages to this. Of course, this is great for security because it means not anyone can always give commands, especially for more secure things. With things like reminders, it also effectively gives you a log because it basically says someone added this to this list. It also means it adds things to the right list for the right person. And possibly one of the best things is because it recognises your voice, when it comes to things like music, it plays the music that you want to hear, not the music someone else wants to hear. This is based on your Apple account and what you listen to. That means someone else doesn't mess up your music preferences as well. And then you also get some bonus features like the intercom feature, which I don't personally use, but is quite nice to have. And then of course, because it is part of the Apple ecosystem, it can do things like find your AirTags. Siri, can you find my phone?
Looking for Mark's iPhone 15.
It can even set up directions ready for your phone, so perhaps while you're putting your shoes on, you can send those directions across. And then you can also make calls and things like that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you also have Siri shortcuts, and this basically gives you endless possibilities because you can create anything you want as a shortcut, pretty much. This means I've got a shortcut that tells me what bin day is and what's being collected each week, and I can trigger that with my voice. And really with shortcuts, as long as you're prepared to spend the time kind of going down the rabbit hole and creating something, you can create whatever you like. And I actually think this probably makes the Apple voice assistant the most customizable one out there now. But there are downsides. And there are times when Apple's voice assistant can't do things that others can. So for example, if you take smart locks, if you have an Amazon or Google voice assistant and you want to lock your door, it will ask you for a PIN code that you set up, and it will then action it once it authorizes that PIN code. With Apple, it just tells you to continue on your iPhone. Recipes is another example. With Amazon Voice Assistant, you can ask for a recipe and it will announce that recipe to you, albeit a little bit too fast to follow, but it's still useful to have. Again, with Apple's Voice Assistant, it tells you to continue on your phone. Siri, can you get me a recipe for chocolate chip brownies?
Okay, Mark, I found some web results. I'll send them to your iPhone.
But really, for my personal use case, there isn't really anything the Apple Voice Assistant doesn't do that I want it to. And that brings us to a nice point to conclude this video. Because actually, after using this as my sole voice assistant for a year, I don't miss Amazon's. Apple offers higher security. It offers a better integration with all of the other Apple products you've got. And actually, if you have a Apple kind of family, then it's easily the best voice assistant. And Apple's voice assistant is not only more than capable of running your smart home, but the Siri shortcuts allow you to create endless possibilities and customizations. And the best bit about all of this is that with the introduction of Matter, more and more products are becoming natively compatible with Apple Home. And that means this is only going to get better. If you guys have got any questions, do stick them below. I'll answer those for you and tell you kind of how I get around different things in my setup or whatever it is you want to know. If you've enjoyed this slightly different video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys again soon.